The New Generation is an era that sits between two of the hottest periods in wrestling history: the golden age of the 1980s and the Attitude Era of the late 90s. Both were times when the WWF was a cultural phenomenon around the world. In comparison, what came in between, from 1993 to 1997, was a version of the WWF that felt out of touch and, frankly, unrecognizable. This was the only time in WWE's history when they were on the verge of extinction, and no wonder, most of their output was terrible. The 80s were very kind to Vince McMahon. For the first couple of years of the 90s, it was business as usual. In April 1990, WrestleMania 6 drew 67,000 fans to the Toronto Skydome, headlined by Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. By this time, however, Hogan was starting to look outside the wrestling business to sustain his career. He had aspirations of becoming a Hollywood star. Vince McMahon could see how restless Hogan was getting, so he lined up the Ultimate Warrior to be his replacement. While the Warrior was hugely popular, he lacked the mainstream appeal of Hogan. Behind the scenes, Warrior's relationship with Vince was rocky at best. He gained a reputation for being difficult, pushing for more money and creative control. In the end, things didn't work out. In 1993, Vince faced a scandal that rocked the wrestling world. He was charged with supplying his performers with steroids, and it looked like he might go to prison. Luckily for him, he was eventually acquitted, but it forced Vince to change the way he presented the WWF. The wrestlers became noticeably smaller, and certain superstars no longer fit onto the roster, metaphorically speaking. Hulk Hogan saw the writing on the wall, and it wasn't long before he jumped to WCW. By mid-1993, the golden era was officially dead. Sadly, what came next was nowhere near as successful. Larger-than-life heroes were replaced by wrestlers with absurd day-job gimmicks. Vince had used these kinds of gimmicks in the 80s, but during the New Generation, he really started scraping the barrel. Take TL Hopper, for example, a man who apparently spent his days unblocking toilets with his faithful plunger, Betsy. In the evenings, he would stick Betsy in his opponents' faces. It was difficult to imagine Hopper ever winning the world title, not just because of his ridiculous gimmick, but also because he was pretty terrible in the ring. Hopper never even had a match on pay-per-view. His gimmick didn't last long, but Tony Anthony, the man behind the character, got a second chance in 1997. He re-debuted as Uncle Cletus, part of the Godwin family. That lasted about a month and a half before he disappeared again. Speaking of the Godwins, they were one of the most tedious tag teams of the New Generation. Henry and Phineas Godwin were supposedly pig farmers, and most of us wished they'd stuck to their day jobs. One of their most memorable moments was dumping a bucket of slop over Sonny's head. At one point, they even tried pushing Henry Godwin as a singles star. He had a memorable feud with a young Triple H, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't just the Godwins making a mess of the tag team division. Take the short-lived Techno Team 2000, for example. Then there were Billy and Bart Gunn, aka the Smoking Guns, the least convincing cowboys in American history. Despite having some of the most boring tag matches of the era, Billy wasn't a bad wrestler. His Mr. Ass character in 1999 was far better than Cowboy Billy, but that wasn't saying much. I mentioned Triple H earlier. His snobby blue blood character was actually pretty good, but he had to work with some truly awful opponents. One of them was Duke the Dumpster Droese, a garbage collector who came to the ring carrying a trash can. Even as a kid, I couldn't figure out why. If you were a garbage man, why would you carry your trash can to work after hours? Dressed in his uniform, he occasionally hit opponents over the head with the can. That's about as exciting as his gimmick ever got. The mid-90s were full of other bad gimmicks: Fantasio the Magician, the Goon the Hockey Player, and Spaceman Max Moon, just to name a few. Let's not forget poor Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese man of war. It's incredible that any of these characters ever made it to TV. Of course, there were exceptions. Over-the-top gimmicks occasionally worked spectacularly well. The best example? The Undertaker. Probably the greatest wrestling character ever created, the concept of a zombie mortician captivated fans immediately. For his on-screen brother, Kane, things were almost very different. Glenn Jacobs played several characters before becoming the Big Red Machine. One of them was Isaac Yankem, DDS, a villainous dentist working alongside Jerry Lawler in a storyline against Bret Hart. For every masterpiece like The Undertaker, there were dozens of two-dimensional day job gimmicks that fell flat. Gimmicks that we saw on the roster at the time were plentiful. There were a bunch of wrestlers during the New Generation who actually avoided getting lumbered with them entirely. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Vader, Psycho Sid, and a few other guys on the roster were just wrestlers. Sure, they had their own personality traits, but they weren't defined by a weird gimmick or occupation. All of these wrestlers were presented as main event level players at one time or another throughout the mid-90s. However, Vince McMahon was desperate to recreate the kind of larger-than-life superstars he had during the 80s. While he did manage to solidify the likes of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels as main eventers and future legends, he also had quite a few failures. For example, he tried to make a main eventer out of King Mabel. Vince always loved big men. That used to manifest itself as muscle-bound bodybuilder types, but after the steroid scandal, he had to be more careful about who he hired. So he shifted his preference from muscle men to large, heavyset wrestlers. Mabel certainly was a large lad. It was 1995, and the WWF had a heel problem. They didn't have enough top-level bad guys on the roster. In a hurry, they booked Mabel to win the King of the Ring tournament. He then went on to challenge Diesel for the WWF title at SummerSlam. For many years, this was considered one of the worst main events in SummerSlam history. Mabel is still spoken about today as one of the worst kings of the ring. The big man was prone to causing injuries, including the time he smashed The Undertaker's orbital bone. This injury led The Undertaker to wear the iconic Phantom of the Opera-style mask upon his return. There were plenty of terrible pay-per-view events during this era, too. That was mostly because the WWF expanded its output and introduced In Your House. These In Your House shows were more frequent, cheaper, and shorter pay-per-views than the likes of SummerSlam, WrestleMania, and the Royal Rumble. This was a desperate attempt by the WWF to earn more money while the business was struggling. What we got, however, were rushed feuds and filler matches that watered down the WWF's product. The undercards were often terrible, and even many of the main events were poorly executed. During this period, Vince made numerous attempts to create fresh main eventers. If we go back to 1993, we can see his attempt to force Lex Luger as the direct replacement for Hulk Hogan. Vince desperately wanted to recapture the 80s magic he had with Hogan, but Lex was the wrong person for the job. The Lex Express tour saw Luger traveling across America in a custom bus plastered with red, white, and blue. The idea was to paint him as the ultimate all-American hero. Despite shaking hands and kissing babies across the United States, Luger lacked the charm and charisma that Hogan had to connect with the audience. Sure, body-slamming Yokozuna on the USS Intrepid was an impressive and patriotic visual, but it wasn't enough to get him over. By the time SummerSlam rolled around, Vince had lost faith in Luger as the new WWF champion. In his match with Yokozuna for the title, Luger won by countout, so the title didn't change hands. The Lex Express sputtered to a halt shortly after, and with it went Vince's dream of creating another Hogan-style megastar. However, one man Vince didn't give up on was Diesel. In 1994, the WWF's roster was thinner than ever, but Diesel checked many of Vince's boxes. He was 6'10" with a muscular build, but he wasn't visibly using steroids. He was undeniably cool and charismatic. Diesel got a rapid push, winning the WWF title in November 1994 in an unexpected victory. However, Diesel ultimately became another failure in Vince's quest for the next megastar world champion. His matches were often criticized for being slow and unexciting. Vince's decision to present him as a smiling babyface undermined the cool, edgy persona he initially had. Despite this, Vince pushed Diesel for nearly a year, but fans stopped attending shows and TV ratings plummeted. The WWF's presentation during the New Generation era created a vacuum in the wrestling business. The WWF had become deeply uncool, almost insulting to watch for anyone over the age of 10. Meanwhile, WCW was capitalizing on this gap, modifying its presentation to appeal to teenagers and adults. WCW boss Eric Bischoff signed both Diesel and Razor Ramon away from the WWF, and Vince was furious.